Greetings, this is Angelus de Mortiel with another multiplayer build guide for Dragon Age Inquisition. Today we will be focusing on building the Keeper as a control leader. The control is any class possessing abilities that alter the actions of enemies, typically falling into the realms of inhibiting or debilitating. The leader is any class that has skills that revolve around buffing allies and debuffing enemies. The Keeper is hands down the best class in this combination and is well known for it. This particular build will not be entirely surprising to many, but roles that are not focused on damage appear not to be well known or understood. As such, this video will not only explain the build and the tactics as usual, but will also show examples of team engagement set pieces on Perilous. Let's start with the build. In the protection tree, first we have Barrier. Barrier is a starting skill for the Keeper and the closest ability to a healing spell available in Inquisition. Barrier casts a protective field on any allies in a targetable 4-meter area of effect, protecting them from upwards of 5,000 damage. However, the barrier starts decaying after a couple of seconds at a rate of about 10% per second. With this in mind, it is important to know the proper timing for when to cast barrier, as it will only last about 10 seconds if left untouched, but much shorter if barrier takes damage. We'll discuss that a bit more in depth later on in the video. Barrier has a moderate 50 mana cost and a cooldown of 24 seconds. The upgrade, Elegant Defense, reduces the cooldown by 4 seconds when a barrier you cast on yourself or an ally expires, either via decay or from taking damage. This means that a barrier cast on all 4 party members of the team will reduce the cooldown by 16 seconds. It should be noted that running multiple classes with barrier and casting in tandem, where one person casts a second barrier just before the first is about to expire, will negate this benefit as barrier did not expire. Finally, barrier placement is a bit of an art because the 4-meter casting AoE is very forgiving, allowing barrier to affect allies a meter or two outside the targeted area. As such, learning just where you need to place the center of the barrier cast for maximal effect is an early talent to master. Next, we have Static Cage. Static Cage is a targetable AoE crowd control ability with a unique mechanic. Essentially, casting Static Cage creates an electric ring on the ground about 9 meters in diameter with an electric orb floating in the air above it. Most enemies that enter the ring that subsequently attempt to exit are yanked back to the middle of the circle and paralyzed for 2 seconds. It is definitely wise to learn quickly that not all enemies are affected, as some stronger enemies are immune to the effect. Furthermore, in order for this to be effective, the enemy has to attempt to leave the cage. If you cast it on a group of archers that are far away from you, it will not be of much use, as the archers will just stand in one place and shoot at you instead of moving. Instead, this is useful to either place in a doorway to catch melee enemies attempting to run through, or on top of your melee allies as they attack enemies that frequently try to dodge, such as Despair Demons. thus preventing that enemy from being able to escape. Static Cage lasts for 8 seconds, has a long 32-second cooldown, and costs a high 65 mana. The upgrade, Lightning Cage, adds an additional effect. When enemies within the cage take damage from any source, they take additional electric damage equivalent to 50% of the Keeper's weapon damage. While this is not an extreme amount of damage, typically ranging from about 20 to 50 electric damage, it's generally effective at increasing the party's DPS as if they added 1 or 2 superb lightning runes to their weapon, which is always a good thing. Finally, in the protection tree, we have Disruption Field. Disruption Field is a non-targetable AoE crowd control ability that creates a 6-meter diameter immobile sphere that reduces the speed of enemies or projectiles caught inside by about half for a duration of 10 seconds. While this sounds primarily like a second means of choke point control like Static Cage above, Disruption Field unfortunately has about 3 times the amount of enemies immune to its effects, and even the enemies that should slow really do not seem to be slowed to enough of a degree or for long enough to be of extreme help. It can be a means of slowing pursuing enemies, which is helpful, but not where it really shines. The real strength of Disruption Field lies in its upgrade, Stasis Lock. Stasis Lock slows enemy movement by 99%, which is practically slowing it to a stop, for 5 seconds, and will end prematurely if that enemy takes damage. However, the most important part, Stasis Lock affects projectiles. Walk through a door and find yourself staring at a handful of archers? No problem. You can take your time carefully studying the details of each individual arrow they loose as the arrows are suspended in the field. This is by far the best enemy range defense in the game, effectively taking all the bite out of pesky archers. The catch? It's a non-targetable AoE spell, meaning that it casts centered on your keeper and the sphere is fixed once cast, so the keeper has to put itself in the line of fire to place it. In the Primal Spirit tree, we have Veilstrike. Veilstrike is a simple, targetable AoE crowd control ability that knocks enemies to the ground in a 5-meter area. It is a simple and effective means to immediately disable a group of enemies. However, the utility improves further with its upgrade, Punching Down. Punching Down reduces the cost by 15 mana and also afflicts enemies with Weaken for 10 seconds. Not only does this make Veilstrike have negligible cost and will reduce the damage from enemies, but it also adds a unique synergy with Static Cage that I'll discuss later. Regarding passives, these first 3 passives are necessary for this build. First, I take Guardian Spirit. Guardian Spirit is an on-death passive that grants you an instant full barrier when you're about to die. This gives you a second chance to evacuate from a bad position or revive that crucial teammate. This is extremely useful, but bear in mind it does have a very long 60-second cooldown, so you will not want to lean on it too much. Secondly, Night Protector. Night Protector is a passive that reduces the decay rate of your barriers by 35%. Roughly translated, this means that your barrier rate of decay will be around 6% per second as opposed to 10% per second, which is about 5 to 7 seconds more barrier if they are left untouched. Finally, we have Strength of Spirits, which increases the strength of your barriers by 50%. This is the single largest increase to your barrier strength and is an absolute must-have passive for any build using the barrier ability. Now for your option. You can either take Smothering Veil to further decrease the damage from enemies when you afflict them with Weaken using Veilstrike by a significant 30%, meaning enemy damage is nearly halved. Or you can choose Gathering Storm, which decreases the cooldown times of all abilities by a half second per basic attack. With one choice, you can absolutely cripple enemy damage, even bosses, making your team's survivability increase on tougher difficulties. With the other choice, you are able to cast all abilities more frequently, increasing your overall effectiveness. Both are extremely good, so it largely depends on how you want to play. Now, let's talk strategy. First, understanding the strategy of this keeper means understanding the control and leader roles. First and most important key to either of these roles is awareness. You have to be watching both enemies and allies while keeping an eye on the mana and skill cooldowns. The second key is knowing what your skills do and on what target each offers the maximum benefit. The first thing to note about Static Cage is that it is an amazing at assisting the tank. By dropping a Static Cage on top of your tank as soon as they pull the enemy, you add a second layer to prevent enemies from getting away from the tank, maximizing their ability to manage the crowd. Secondly, Disruption Field is a very useful defensive tool to stop enemy projectiles from getting to your team. While the projectiles are slowed near to a stop, however, they are still able to do damage, so advise your team to be cautious. Thirdly, Veilstrike is not as effective at overall crowd management like Static Cage. However, it costs far less and has a much faster cooldown, meaning it sees a lot more action. Furthermore, as the electric damage from Lightning Cage upgrade for Static Cage afflicts shock on enemies, it will combine with Weaken from Veilstrike to afflict sleep on enemies, which greatly expounds the crowd control effect of either skill singly and opens those enemies up to powerful cross-class combos. Now, the overall strategy is mostly reactionary based upon how the battle flows. First, though, it's a common sight to see a keeper cast barrier on allies in places like the font room in between zones, which is absolutely useless and means the barrier will most likely be on cooldown when it's actually needed. Instead, you want to cast barrier on primarily your tank, or the whole team if possible, immediately before entering combat. Barrier can continue to be reapplied, again primarily to the tank, as needed throughout the fight. Next, in most scenarios, it is a good plan to drop Static Cage either in a doorway between you and the enemies, or on top of your tank if in an open area. Just note the timing of Static Cage. It takes a second or so to cast, plus there's a brief animation of the cage charging to life in which enemies can still get through. To avoid this, plan ahead and time your cage placement just before the enemies will be coming into it. After that, Veilstrike can be applied immediately after enemies are trapped in the cage in order to put them to sleep and further disable them. Alternatively, though, you can use Veilstrike on a completely separate group of enemies not inside the cage, such as a line of archers. This allows you some situational versatility based upon enemy positioning. Finally, Disruption Field is best placed in a doorway, as its diameter will easily cover the breadth. If in an open area and faced with a group of archers, move the team just around a corner from the archers, called the line of sight tactic, and place Disruption Field specifically on the edge of that corner. This will force the archers to have to move to you to regain line of sight and subsequently be trapped in the field. Something else to note, as Disruption Field and Static Cage both cost a high 65 mana, it is important to use Disruption Field a bit more sparingly as its use is more specialized. Most frequently, I never cast Disruption Field on melee enemies unless it's needed for some special reason. Again, as I say with all of my build guides, this is not the best build for the Keeper. There is no best build for any class, but rather just builds designed for specific tasks. Have another way to build the Keeper? Let me know in the comments below. As always, if you enjoyed the video or have something to say, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Once again, this is Angelus de Mortiel signing off.